In those halcyon days, one important factor was that we had managed to accumulate a considerable operating reserve. I could tell someone how we did it. Not quite the year's cash operating budget that Bill Gates has always kept on hand, but upwards of a third of that. Hardy and I called the reserve our wasting endowment because we dipped into it whenever something sufficiently important needed to be done. This gave us considerable flexibility to quickly pursue good ideas when they popped up. In fact, this reserve was just part of a whole different management philosophy that we employed. We didn't, for example, pre-assign unitary budgets for this group or that to spend as they liked. Nobody stalled out because they'd run through their budget, while money was wasted on trivialities somewhere else. Unlike so many so-called managers, we knew every part of our business intimately, and so we were equipped to operate like this. For that matter, we knew everything about the entire conservancy. I used to say, if you want to know TNC, learn BCD. And we sometimes shared our reserve out a bit among other conservancy departments. The rest all operated with traditional budget practices and had no reserves when something came up that we thought significant. For instance, when Brad Northrup's administration department decided to bring the membership data in-house from an outside service bureau, we bought a second HP mini computer for them and trained Lyndon Woodall, Peter Whitford, and others until they were up and operating. Databases for donor information and other support functions were added, and we even helped design several of them. Another digression. I've never been able to comprehend why governments always return excess revenues as tax returns, or why most organizations spend every penny on current operations. Can't they hold back some of it? Can't they grasp the immense importance of maintaining a flexible resource pool? But then their managers generally don't know anything. Here I want to step back a bit and acknowledge two quite important things that didn't begin with me, and to cite the people with whom they did. It may surprise you to know that it wasn't I that originated the idea of the element occurrence. The inspiration for this came from Dale Jenkins, not related by the way, an entomologist and the chief ecologist for the Smithsonian. We became friends just after I started the Conservancy, when we both served on two overlapping committees, the IBP Inventory Committee, separate federal committee on research in natural areas. Dale and I had convergent interests and within a couple of years had co-founded a joint venture called the Smithsonian Center for Natural Areas, another untold story ending in intrigue and perfidy. And built up a small staff, mostly doing contract inventories for the Park Service's National Natural Landmarks program. From somewhere, we got a grant to do an inventory of the area surrounding the Chesapeake Bay. We'd basically been using the old IBP check sheet approach, but in this case, Dale thought it was a good idea to throw in known localities for some rare species, which we began gleaning from the Smithsonian specimen collections. You might have thought that I'd had my eureka moment right then and there, but no, it took another several years before things suddenly gelled in my mind. When they did, this memory from the Chesapeake inventory immediately clicked into place. The second thing I didn't think of first was element ranking. After my eureka moment, I was too busy to engage in inventory myself. Those who engaged were encountering difficulties I had foreseen. One of these was the practical question of how to ascertain which elements were rare and needing attention. We all knew that official lists of protected endangered species were undocumented nonsense. But my simple-minded idea was that after creating a preliminary list, we would hustle out and gather occurrence information. And then the accumulating occurrence data would begin to tell us what was rare. I just never ran the numbers. Fortunately, not too long after the new process began, I visited the even newer Minnesota program to review progress. I met individually with each member of the staff, and when I got to Welby Smith, the botanist, he told me, maybe a little reluctantly because everyone knew how strongly I felt about standardization, that his first step after compiling a complete list of vascular plants was to stratify them. He was already an expert on Minnesota's flora and knew more than enough to begin segregating into those taxa that were demonstrably abundant, those that were common, those that he and others believed to be rare, and those about which he didn't know enough to make a preliminary judgment. Then he began gathering information, including occurrence information, on those in the latter categories. As soon as he told me this, I said, of course, probably clapping my hand on my head, and went home to begin work on a formalized rarity and endangerment assessment and documentation process. My first cut at element ranking wasn't much different from Welby's, but as with everything else, this went through many iterative and tortuous stages before it settled into a relatively stable form. Hardy recently reminded me of some of the significant steps, like the split into GS and N ranks, but no time for that here. What a difference those ranks made. How different a project package was with not just names of things, but ranks attached. I never thought I could evaluate a project until that happened. As for me, the methodology and system design weren't my only jobs at the Conservancy. I was also the chief fundraiser for Science and Heritage. We received very little of our support from the Conservancy General Fund. About 95% of what we did at headquarters and in our regional offices was self-funded, as was all the vastly greater funding for the state heritage programs. I was initially the salesman for new programs also, but John Nutter soon took the lead on this, and when he changed jobs, Hardy took over. Frank Warren called Hardy our traveling salesman. A few words on selling programs. Early on, we set up a priority list of states, ranked mostly by the likelihood that they would buy the idea. We were completely wrong. It turned out to be easier to penetrate a vacuum than to get into a state with an established natural areas program and vested interests. Some people wanted to produce a brochure, but I never would, because I knew that we needed to bait the hook to suit the fish. For example, a key contact in one state would be hell-bent for land use planning, and his or her counterpart in the next would absolutely hate it. And by not pre-committing, we can honestly say that our same unvarying program could be looked at either way, as land use planning provides an alternative to it. These days, I'd have a brochure in digital form that would tailor it to state prejudices. Anyway, selling the states was often very hard, but Hardy persisted. He had it boiled down to a 5-stage process. You'll have to ask him about that. And getting all 50 states was his triumph. But to continue, I was also the main liaison between the department and the Conservancy at large, where I was still a main theoretician and spiritual guide, and a fundraiser as well, drafting a number of their largest proposals, as far as I can remember, conceiving every one of their national campaigns. I was also the department's emissary to the outside world, giving speeches, writing papers and stuff, and it fell on me to be the chief politician. The internal and external politics were always fierce, and I fought more battles than Napoleon, winning all the crucial ones, but the last. Frankly, taken all together, the job was an awful grind. I didn't eat breakfast or lunch, slept about 4 or 5 hours a night, asked my wife, waking up frequently to write notes, worked 60 hours a week, often 70 or 80, took 2 sick days in 23 years and gave up almost a year of unused vacation time, and I finally quit. I'm not naturally energetic, ask anybody. But the pressure to move forward was always great, and it was generally easier for me to do it than to try to explain to somebody how to do it. Here's a typical story. At the end of a heritage conference in Paraguay, when everybody else went off for a multi-day trip to Iguazu Falls, I was back in Asuncion working on another damn system problem. Other Conservancy people traveled a lot to scope out the landscape and seemed to enjoy it, but I never had time to. I traveled to unavoidable meetings, heritage and Conservancy offices, or potential funding sources. My life was spent in the office. The only thing that saved me was that I did as little as possible on the administrative side. Hardy Whiting, Bob Chipley, John Nutter, Lynn Loring Schwartz, Shelley Rodman, and others took care of nearly all of that. It's lucky for me my Spanish was so bad, or I would have been translating everything into Espanol. About the only person outside the department who ever fathomed my workload was Beryl Collins, for several years the chairperson of the board science committee and an early computer guru herself. She was aghast to discover that I was still functioning as chief technician and urged me to give it up. Was this any way for the head of such an enterprise to behave? Delegate, delegate. Well, I really wanted to. Maybe I could get a life, and the rest of my jobs could always benefit from more attention. So I tried 3 times to replace myself as chief designer, but it never worked out. One of the candidates was notably smarter than me, I thought, and I had high hopes. He was an able mathematician, had a strong computer background, a quick grasp of many things I could scarcely fathom, and lacked my attention deficit disorder. Yes, I suffered from that all my life. I don't understand how it goes with my eyes glazing over last. Anyway, this guy was terrific, but he lacked my long experience and motivation. And when he began to understand what a boggling thing it was, he bolted for a musical career. No, it wasn't Art Garfunkel. If only we could have gotten him. Back to the grind for me. I was going to tell a long story here about the most grueling episode of my system design career, developing the modules for the Conservancy's project business. It was one of the most complex things I ever did, and I did it almost entirely alone, working straight through 1 night a week for what turned out to be a year and a half. I don't know if any of you have even seen it, but that part of the data structure, but it was the last major part of the BCD and is still used to manage Conservancy project data, driven by later generations of software. The same way the rest of the data model still underlies your own work. As far as I know, it's still the best anyone's ever done in systematizing the complexities of real estate. I'm going to rewind this up. Oh, I see the gasps of relief. By recounting how finally having to let it all go, or rather, how it was wrested from my hands. As I mentioned earlier, the science and heritage programs within TNC were almost completely self-funded. Otherwise, they wouldn't have existed at all because internal competition for dollars was strong. The last year I was in charge, in 1993, our core science operating budget was about $15 million. With the combined budgets of all the heritage programs, not directly within our control to be sure, but still part of an integrated operation, many times greater. Our operating reserves stood at nearly $5 million. If we had been a standalone organization, our core budget and staff numbers alone would have put us among the 10 largest conservation organizations in the world. If we counted the budget and staff of the entire network, the combined enterprise would have placed second only to TNC itself, or perhaps it was even bigger. I've never really made a detailed comparison. Our clear path required us to keep growing if we were to continue to lead the way, keep up with changing technology, and complete our drive to blanket the earth. But with relative suddenness, we hit the wall. The reason was that the Conservancy, and especially the state field offices, had grown up around us, and now someone else had first call on every private funding source. Over the years, we've cracked more than 100 foundations and corporations for first grants to the Conservancy, and often the biggest ever. And now we had access to not a single one of them. The problem goes back to the behavior of the funders. Nearly all the foundations, corporations, and individuals are checklisters. If they give a grant to the California field office, they check off the TNC box for that funding cycle with no opportunity for another branch of the organization to even get a hearing. We could have fought it out within TNC for access. That's how these things were usually resolved. But the best we could hope for was only a fraction of what we needed. Besides, we cared about the other Conservancy functions, and displacing a proposal from a field office in favor of one of ours didn't seem like a winning proposition, nor one that would maintain harmony within the organization. There were already tensions enough. On more than one occasion, for instance, I was able to find out strong attempts to make state heritage programs or state heritage staffs report directly to the Conservancy field offices. I generally deflected this with the argument that it was more logical for them to report to you. I believe that. I concluded that the only rational solution to our funding impasse was for science to spin off as its own organization, with its own box in the funder's checklist. I wrote a white paper arguing the case, proposing a division of labor model for a sort of super organization in which science and heritage spin-off would continue to develop and support information systems for TNC use at no cost to them, and allow them to redirect their science activity into ecological management. I thought it was a great plan, and actually pushed it through to the final staff approval stage. In one meeting, John Sawhill told me, "Quit arguing, Bob. You've got what you want." However, he forbade me to distribute the white paper to the Board of Governors or to argue the case to them. I was warned by one friendly board member to know that a board would never let something so successful and ornamental out of their hands. Boards are short on deep institutional theory or knowledge, as are generalist presidents, and in the end, sure enough, they wouldn't let us go. I blew up in the science committee at my second last board meeting and denounced the alternative plan at my last and take no prisoner terms, calling it a hopeless and incompetent plan generated by incompetent people, and resigned in disgust. I probably shouldn't have done that. I retired to my tent, hoping the TNC would eventually come to a sensus, but no one there ever did. Of course, they did eventually spin you off, in what at least one board member publicly declared was that Jenkins was right move. But when the moment came, they failed to create the division of labor model that I proposed, and I repeatedly entreated subsequent Conservancy leaders to institute the model, but they reneged on their promises to do so. In failing to do this right, TNC damaged itself, you, and the overall biodiversity conservation enterprise. Well, but then my greatest shortfall was the failure to sufficiently transform the Conservancy culture. Pope's gone, let's party. They've gone off and made huge, duplicative, disparate, and inefficient system investments that contributed nothing to the main sequence and accomplished far too little to even meet their own preserved needs. Another subject I tire of. As for me, as I left TNC, I had a sort of exit interview with John Sawhill. He said to me, "Bob, with your record, you can write your own ticket." That's how these careerists think and talk, especially guys that never spent more than 5 years in a job. Any university or conservation organization will be eager to have you. "No, John," I replied. "I've made myself into a machine for doing exactly the thing that I do." I won't be good for anything else. And there's nothing else that I want to do. Anyway, in closing, I'd just like to say, here I'm looking soulfully at the plaque. Of all the awards I've ever received, because of who's giving it, this most recent one means the most to me. After all this time, I still think of you as my people. So, thank you.